Hello guys, as promised in the last video, we said we were going to go into more detail about the manufacturing costs, because that can be tricky. So companies that are making a product can categorize their costs, their manufacturing costs, into three different categories. Direct materials, or as I call it, DM, direct labor, or DL, and then manufacturing overhead. I can't overstate how much we're going to be using these terms and these categories for this entire semester. So please watch this video, pause it, take really good notes, because it's important for you to understand for the rest of the semester. And manufacturing overhead is the last item. We classify that as MO. All right, so again, if you're making something, your costs can be separated into these three categories. Let's go ahead and define them. So direct materials are the components used in production in the production process, whose costs are easily traceable. I'll say easily identified, as your book uses. Easily identified. Okay. And sometimes there are longer definitions for that, just depending on the textbook. So direct materials are the raw materials used in the production process whose costs are easily traceable is a good way of saying that, or easily identified. All right, direct labor. These are your production labor costs. Production labor costs that can be easily traceable or identified. MO is all our costs. All other costs incurred in the production process. That are not easily traceable. I'm going to add a little extra thing here, or economically feasible to do so. Feasible to measure as either DM or DL. And then there's some additional categories within manufacturing overhead. There's actually three. Okay, the first is indirect materials. Indirect materials. So materials used in the production process, not easily traceable to the end product. Right? Think about like when you're baking cookies and you have to put in just a little bit of baking powder, just a little bit, right? 1/4 of a teaspoon. It is such, like, yes, it is a material that you need to have in the final product, otherwise it won't taste good. So it is a material, but it's such a small part that it's hard to trace the cost of that to the end product, right? You have to take that can of baking powder and divide it by all the 1/4 teaspoons that are in there. That would be very laborious, right? And then you have to take that 1/4 teaspoon to the batch and divide it by the number of cookies that you made in that batch. It's just not worth it. It's not economically feasible to measure. You would spend more time calculating that than it's worth. So it would be classified as an indirect material. You also have indirect labor. So these are labor costs of those not directly involved in the active conversion of materials. Okay, so labor not directly involved in the active conversion of materials. And then finally, we have the category of other. Everything else. Okay, so all other MO costs that doesn't fall into indirect materials or indirect labor. Okay, so it might seem a little bit nebulous right now, a little confusing, but do copy down these definitions, and then we're going to go through an example. So recently, we built a free library at my house. It's something I'd always wanted, and then with shelter in place, we decided to go ahead and do it. So we recently built a free library. So when we started making it, we had to go first to Home Depot, and we had to buy wood. We had to buy screws. We had to buy hinges. We had to buy a, what's that called, doorknob. We had to get 2 sets of latches. Or I guess it's the same as hinges. Oh, the latch, I remember. We had a little latch that from here grabs onto the doorknob. That way, if wind comes around, it won't fly it open. We have 2 hinges here so the door can open. We have some plexiglass so that you can see the books through that little door. And then we had to get some shingles. I think that's pretty much everything. And we had to get some paint. We wanted to paint it and make it look pretty. Okay, so all of these items, that's an example of raw materials. Now, just because it's a raw material doesn't mean that it's a direct material, okay? For it to be a direct material, it has to be easily traceable, easily identified to the final product. So my DM, I would say for this project, would be wood, maybe paint, shingles. Okay. The plexiglass was pretty expensive, plexiglass. And so notice what I just did there is I quantified it, and that's how most management accountants end up deciding whether it goes into DM or IM, right? Is it a direct material or is it an indirect material? And they usually base it upon money, right? So all these were pretty significant costs of the final product. If it's not a significant cost, that means it's not economically feasible for us to trace it. Then we're going to put it into indirect material. So think of it as being a low cost. So for example, the screws that we use, the 2 hinges, the latch, the doorknob. Okay, because those are relatively small in amount. So we would classify those as indirect materials. Now moving on to our next category of labor, we have direct labor or indirect labor. So direct labor, that would be all the time it took for us to make it, right? To take these raw pieces of wood, just these, strips of wood, and actually cut it and sand it and shape it into the free library. So direct labor, so that would be my husband. His name is Brian. So I'd say, Brian, I don't know how many hours it took. Let's say 20 hours. Okay. And then to make it a cost, we have to quantify it. We'd multiply it by his labor rate. So let's say his labor rate was $25 per hour. That would be your direct labor cost. Indirect labor, usually that's like a supervisor. So that's definitely me. I just kind of watched over his shoulder with my cup of coffee and I was like, yeah, that's good. Do that. Oh, what about this? And just kind of complained and did that the whole time, gave him direction and guidance. So let's say I spent about 6 hours, and let's say my rate is like $50 an hour. So that would be your indirect labor cost. The difference between the two, only one of these people is actually touching the materials, right? He's touching it and crafting it and cutting it and molding it, and I'm just kind of standing over his shoulder and supervising. So that's the difference between direct and indirect. All right, and now we go on to Mo. Okay, so Mo, we've already talked about indirect materials, indirect labor, because we know Mo is made up of indirect materials, indirect labor, and other. We have already addressed the IM and the IL. Okay, so what are some other costs? Any other costs associated with making the product that aren't captured in IM or IL? Most of the time, that's going to be things like rent, utilities, insurance, like property insurance. What else? I know a big one. Yeah, supplies and equipment. Right? Think of all the equipment we had to use. Saws, drills, hammers, sanders, right? All that, none of that is captured up here because we already had it. We didn't need to go purchase it at Home Depot. We had it, but those are costs, right? So equipment, specifically depreciation on equipment. Okay, and that's a big one. And just in case you're curious in how this shakes out for most manufacturing companies in terms of the breakdown of costs, most manufacturers say that they spend about 54% of their costs on direct materials, about 13% on labor, and 33% on Mo. So you can see the majority of the costs for making a product comes from the materials. And I can definitely attest to that because we spent a lot. Those shingles alone, my goodness gracious, they were a lot. Okay, so now we know our definitions. I gave you a quick example, and we're going to have other examples in this module. Don't worry.